COVID's kind of the shadow that's over everything in this country. And as we enter into our 1-year anniversary of this thing, and Dr. Matt Howie has been a guy who's been on the front lines of this. He is a family medicine, but he's also associated with the county here as a health strategist. And we've been taking a look at some of the vaccine distribution so far and some of the stories about COVID and how the medical community is dealing with it. And Dr. Howie joins us again this morning here on WSBA. Dr. Howie, an honor to always have you aboard. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, talk a little bit about your role with the county, because you are a health strategist in addition to being a family medicine doctor. And, tell us what, you're doing right now with the county and some of the things that are happening right now with regard to COVID right here in your county.
Well, health strategist is kind of what it sounds like. It's an opportunity to take a look at how we're responding to health-related issues in a strategic level, and are we doing the things right? And I can tell you right now, when it comes to COVID, it's all about collaboration. It's all about working with our partners, making sure that we have the capacity to deliver vaccine when we get that increased supply that we hope to get soon.
How is it going so far? We talked, about a week and a half ago, and, we said you're at the mercy of the supply that's coming down. Was the supply oversold in the beginning? Did we think there was going to be more out there? Is there more out there? Is it somehow not getting through in the supply chains? What's your understanding of that so far?
Well, I can tell you, I think early on we were hopeful that we would have more supply, but the answer there was a lot of the absence of information rather than any kind of promises not kept. It was we just didn't know, and so we were hoping that it was there, but without information, you plan for the best, and hopefully you can have that ability to pivot when that opportunity comes. That becomes a challenge. There's a lot of pent up demand right now, and trying to do that in the way that's the most equitable way possible that gets the highest risk folks vaccinated is really, really critical.
You talked about partnerships, and you talked about working together right out of the gate this morning, and I couldn't agree with you more. But we're seeing some of the stories. We saw a story on Wednesday here in Pennsylvania about some of the shots are going to be delayed because second doses were given as first doses when they came out. We saw some stories around the country this week about, there's like 20 million doses missing out there somewhere unaccounted for. Is that just part of the price of doing business? That's not something that anybody wants to hear right now, especially with the need for getting doses out and not wanting to waste any of this. What's your thought from a medical standpoint, from a guy in the medical community, when you hear those kind of things?
Well, first, when you work in these spaces, you want to assume good intent to begin with until you have information that kind of confirms otherwise. So when I hear about somebody giving a second dose as a first dose, I think what happens often in those scenarios is people just want to get vaccine out there, and they don't quite understand where they are in the queue and what they have to be responsible for. So I don't know the details, but we're going to assume good intent. We're doing a mass vaccination on a scale we haven't seen in a long, long time. And we're talking about back to the polio vaccine when you used to go to your school to get the sugar cube. Because, no surprise that we're going to have major logistical and infrastructure challenges. We're going to work through those. Missing doses. Typically you do understand that sometimes there's a little bit of fact underneath that, and that there's actually a lot of misinterpretation of potentially those facts when you learn a little bit more. So again, we're going to prepare for when it's available. We're confident it will be available, and when that time comes, we want to be ready as a community.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point you just made, that sometimes those numbers get out there. They make great headlines, but all of a sudden later on, about page 4 or 5, 10 days later, you find out, oh, yeah, they are accounted for. Maybe they were used this way. That's it. But anytime we have this kind of stuff, it's going to be rife for mistakes and so forth. And again, when we've developed the vaccine faster than any vaccine we've ever seen before, this has been kind of an amazing year when you really think about it in that regard, right?
Extraordinary on all levels, extraordinary challenges, extraordinary resilience that's being seen by the community, and, the scientific community and pharmaceutical industry and the health community really working very hard together to try to get this done. It's pretty amazing to watch. It is.
We're talking with Dr. Matt Howie this morning here on WSBA about things here in York County. Everyone, and I know you're one of the guys who's been cautioning people on this, and I think rightfully so, to be patient. That this is a process, obviously, but everybody starts to hear these words, herd immunity, a lot. As you look down the line, and maybe it's too early to even, maybe it's unfair to ask you this question, but I'll ask you anyway. Where do you see herd immunity taking place, and what exactly is it? For a lot of people out there that hear about that and say, "Oh yeah, okay, we can take our masks off." That's how simple it gets to them. What does it really mean to get herd immunity, and do you see that anywhere on the horizon?
I think there's suggestions of herd immunity in different pockets, even right now, where you have had significant disease in a population. You have a lot of immunity in that population, and those are subpopulations, but we're seeing suggestions of it. In healthcare workers, we're seeing the incidence of individuals calling off for either isolation because they've been diagnosed with it or because they've been exposed to it. That's decreasing, and the overall rate of disease is decreasing. Now, it's too early to say that's herd immunity. But herd immunity is just creating an environment where the virus doesn't have the ability to go from person to person, or what we call from vector to vector, because that other person, that next individual that would be potentially infected, potentially has immunity to it, or there's enough individuals that have immunity that it kind of squelches it. Think of it as a seed that doesn't find fertile ground.
Dr. Howie, it's almost been a year now since we went into this full bore. What do we know now that we didn't know a year ago? Obviously, the vaccine is a known, but as far as from a medical standpoint, what do we know about COVID now that we didn't know a year ago, March?
COVID is an acute infection, but it also has chronic elements to it for certain people. And so, I think we're going to continue to understand that once you're done with COVID, COVID may not be done with you, and that people do have a recovery period after the infection, and that for some it can be quite significant. I think we've learned that. I think we've learned that we're, as a community, are vulnerable, as vulnerable as the most vulnerable in our population, and that our health is actually dependent on our neighbors around us. And the decisions they make do affect us. But we need to actually have a mindset of that what's good for an individual has to also be good for this population. And the haves and have-nots in healthcare, it just doesn't serve any of us well.
I was reading this week about how some people are saying it's going to be endemic, the idea that it's going to be similar to, eventually, to the flu, that you have flu season every year. I mean, we have shots for the flu, we have, medicine for the flu, and yet we still have people who die from the flu each year. And again, you mentioned about different populations. Do you see this becoming endemic, that we'll come into, COVID season, if you will, and have to go through that much like we do with the flu each year?
It kind of appears that's the pattern that appears to be developing. It's a coronavirus. Lots of coronaviruses have a cyclical nature based on season and time of year for a host of reasons, both, behavioral from where we spend our time, as well as, environment, temperature, humidity, those sorts of things. So I do think that we're going to see a cyclical, for the foreseeable future, a cyclical part of COVID. So we're going to have to learn how to live with COVID. With improved vaccination, however, it will not have the impact. And as well as, once it breaks into a community and you have increasing amounts of immunity to it, you're not going to see it as devastating for large swaths of the population. But for vulnerable individuals, we're still going to be really sick people in hospitals and in ICUs in COVID season for the foreseeable future. The goal is to minimize it.
One final question for you. Do you worry at all, as a medical person, that we'll lower the standard here, that something might come along, maybe not as serious as COVID, but we might kind of, run and hide a little bit, for lack of a better term, and not really deal with it, that we've lowered the bar at which we as a nation really kind of deal with this whole thing? Your thoughts about that? About 20 seconds left.
I'm optimistic, actually. I think that we've learned that we have a great resilience and an ability to pull together when we have to. It can be bumpy and ugly at times, but honestly, in the end, I think we did pull together. We're seeing masks where we've never seen masks before. So we're seeing people distance when they didn't want to, but they felt that they need to. I think we'll rise to the challenge again, and hopefully we can do it in a more cohesive manner. Good, positive stuff. Dr. Howie, always appreciate you being aboard. We look forward to talking to you again very soon, and thank you so much for the information this morning. It's really helpful. Hey, I appreciate the invitation. Take care now. Dr. Matt Howie with us here on WSBA Morning News with Gary Sutton.